Welcome to our podcast, our very first podcast of the Young IFA Network. I'm your host, Franklin, and today we have a very special guest, Nico Sciberras, Director on Indirect Taxation at the Malta Tax and Customs Administration, the MTCA. Nico, thank you for joining us. Can you tell us a bit about you and your experience?
Thank you, Franklin, for welcoming me into your first podcast. It's an honor. It's a delight to be here. Just a little bit about myself, Nico Sciberras. I'm Director for Indirect Taxation. Sometimes people get a bit mixed up about having those direct and indirect. But basically my role consists of handling VAT, customs and excise matters within the MTCA, particularly from when it comes to legal, international and technical affairs. So basically I deal both at the domestic and international levels. We're in charge of domestic legislation and to negotiations at the EU and the international levels. When it comes to both VAT and customs, a lot going on right now.
Can imagine.
Both domestically and internationally.
Very good.
But yeah, that we'll I guess we'll have more we'll dive into that.
And once again, thank you. It's always a pleasure and an honor to have someone like you with your expertise and competence to come and share your knowledge with all of us, especially with our audience. So Nico, I'm going to jump into our first question for this podcast. So what are the most significant recent EU changes that gaming companies need to be aware of in 2026? Just before we started recording, in actual fact, we were discussing of certain new rules which have been published. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about that?
Sure, of course. Gaming is a very interesting industry, I would say. I've always had a very, very keen interest in the industry, especially from a VAT perspective. The rules are very, very interesting and tend to be quite a bit complex. From an international perspective, not much developments there, I would say. So what we have is basically, when it comes to gambling, a special exemption on gambling in the EU VAT directive, which essentially mandates member states. I wouldn't say mandates. It says member states shall exempt gambling transactions, however, subject to the conditions and limitations as the member state may lay down. And this has historically been interpreted by member states as giving a very wide element of discretion as to what a member state exempts or otherwise. So those conditions and that freedom to set the conditions and limitations has always been widely interpreted. And in fact, the Court of Justice in 2024, I believe it was, in two separate cases, which started off in Belgium, reinforced this concept that the member states are free in setting those conditions and limitations and essentially having very wide discretion as to what to exempt or otherwise when it comes to gambling transactions. And what has that led to? That has led to us in Malta changing up the whole framework. Mm-hmm. So you said sort of that you've heard that we're carrying out quite a bit of changes domestically. And I would say the main change there is the application of this exemption. So previously what we used to exempt is basically everything when it comes to gambling transactions except pretty much online casino, RNG offerings online. What we've done is a complete shift to taxing almost everything, with the exception of gambling offerings which are difficult to tax. And that is sort of why the exemption is there in the first place. The exemption on gambling is there because it is difficult to tax certain gambling transactions. But with the technologies that we have today, and with how gambling has developed in today's day and age, This challenge is much less persistent, I would say, except for certain transactions, like for example low risk games. You know, the tombola which the casino organizes. You know, the
my favorite.
the old people's homes bingo. You know, you're not going to tax those realistically. Then there is those are called low risk games, sort of.
So it's quite an impact from having everything exempt to now, you said, taxing everything at the 18%.
Yes, rate? Yes, 18% rate. However, it comes with other changes which support these changes. So there are also changes in place of supply rules.
Yes, and that leads to another question, which you can tackle now. That's very good.
Yes. There are also changes in place of supply rules, which will ensure that... So VAT is a consumption tax, right?
Yes.
So the changes we've made were to ensure that, listen, VAT is applied at the place of consumption. Mm-hmm. So if the service is not consumed in Malta, then it should not be taxed in Malta. Mm-hmm. In the case of gambling transactions, where are the services consumed?
Where the player is located.
It is where the player is located. So we fine-tuned our place of supply rules to tax, to ensure that the place of supply is where the player is located. Mm-hmm. So, for example, previously, sports betting, for example, used to be treated as a non-electronically supplied service. Mm-hmm. So there was a rule saying, listen, sports betting is not an electronically supplied service. And what does this mean? Essentially, it means that, listen, from a Maltese perspective, we're saying the service takes place in Malta, essentially. However, we've fine-tuned it saying, listen, when the sports betting transaction is essentially automated, you know, there's no interaction between the supplier and the person placing a bet at the point they're placing the bet, and then the processing, you know, that's all. There's no human interaction there, you know, there's minimal human interaction.
Exactly.
So we're saying that, listen, that is an electronically supplied service, and therefore it should be taxed where the player is established. Mm-hmm. So essentially you end up with a framework where it is taxable in nature. However, it is only taxed if it takes place in Malta. So we're only taxing consumption which takes place in Malta, which is...
All right. Okay. So I'd say, of course, I do not have the official statistics, but most of our B2C gaming companies, they would supply their games to customers which are located in various EU states. So in that case, the gaming company, and this is another question as well, looking at the risk, the company would need to register in those countries where the players are located.
So, apart from EU, naturally, there are also non-EU jurisdictions.
Exactly.
So gaming companies in Malta supply to both EU and non-EU.
Exactly. I'm excluding non-EU purposely.
I understand. I perfectly understand. When it comes to EU, it should be borne in mind that there is, as we started off, a sort of discretion as to whether to apply exemption or to apply taxation to gambling transactions. So you could have a situation where the place of supply, where the customer is established, does not want to tax that transaction. So if that is the case, then there is no tax to be paid by the gambling operator in Malta if that service is exempt in the place where it takes place, where it is consumed. So in that case, there might not be any registration obligations to pay VAT, of course, etc. But there could very well be member states which decide to tax certain gambling transactions, and in that case, there are, I would say, two options. You could either register for VAT in that member state and declare as you would normally, Or you could register for the one-stop shop in Malta in order to use the simplification scheme sort of to account for the VAT which you should be paying in the other member states. You pay it to the MTCA and we pass it on to the respective member states. But of course you need to be calculating how much VAT you need to pay, the rate, etc.
Exactly. Understood. And we also mentioned that sort of these new rules might also not impact only gaming companies, but also suppliers, like payment services, for example, who provide a service to gaming companies. In what way do you think that this will impact those kind of providers as well?
Okay, so previously, given that most gambling transactions were exempt without credit, meaning that there is no right of recovery on the expense side. Mm-hmm. When it comes to services provided to the gaming companies, naturally there will now be a natural right to recover that VAT. And there was also a certain application of the exemption which extended to supplies related to gambling. Mm-hmm. Okay, and as is currently included in the guidelines. So of course, those supplies related to gambling will now become taxable, but with the gambling company having the right to deduct that VAT on its input supplies.
Okay, understood. So this would also trigger compliance and registration issues in the sense if a company is registered as exempt without credit, does it need to change its registration as well?
Potentially, yes. Very good point. Yes, potentially, yes. Naturally, they need to, the respective company will need to assess its position, mm-hmm. Whether it is supplying whether it was utilizing the exemption related to supplies related to gambling, or whether it was relying, for example, on another exemption and therefore can retain its exempt status. What am I speaking about? For example, we were discussing previously payment service providers. So payment services could not necessarily fall under another exemption, which is separate from the gambling exemption. There is a specific exemption for transactions concerning payments, even negotiation concerning payments. Mm-hmm. So the payment service provider would need to assess potentially whether its payment services fall under that exemption. But just because you are a payment service provider, it does not mean that the exemption relating to transactions concerning payments will automatically apply. Mm. You need to be fulfilling a very specific function in relation to that payment service in order to be able to fulfill, to classify under that exemption. Mm-hmm. So I would say you really need to assess as a support, sort of as a supporting service to gambling companies. This might impact you as well.
So in a nutshell, I mean, these new rules, which were issued following CJEU judgments, it's something that all industry, and not just the gaming industry, sort of needs to be aware of as well and be familiar with. Nico, I'm going to move on to another question, and possibly our last one, because as usual, time flies by. They say when you're having fun, it's always like that. VAT and fun are not usually assimilated together.
For me, they go together, but for most people, they don't.
Yeah. So, one final question. What are the key VAT risks or common mistakes gaming companies make, and how we can mitigate them? And in this, I would like to point out as well that a way to mitigate these risks is to always keep a lookout on publications and guidelines issued by the MTCA and yourself. That is something which even I experienced. The administration is very, very helpful as well. You offer guidance and outreach as well, not just from an indirect point of view, but for others. So that's, in my opinion, one way of mitigating the risk, keeping abreast of rules, regulations, judgments, and all of that. So over to you now to sort of give your final points as to what VAT risks do you see, do you face in your position?
So what I would suggest in order to mitigate risks is to set the MTCA webpage as your homepage.
Good idea.
Jokes aside, what VAT risks that commonly pop up currently, I would say, and what we're looking out for is structures in Malta where there would not be potentially sufficient substance to provide the services which on the books are being provided. And that is something which sometimes we see and what we are pressing down on very hard.
Also an international, so my background is more international tax as well, and substance has always been pivotal, you know,
Exactly.
it's always important.
Exactly.
If you don't have actual hard law on economic substance ourselves, like BVI, for example, maybe it's something that collectively we should work on as well, if substance is so important, which is.
Indeed, and I mean, perfectly hit the nail on the head. It's not only important from a VAT perspective. Mm-hmm. It's important from a global tax perspective, yes. Globally for all taxes. But of course, with an attractive tax framework, of course, you attract certain operators which want to benefit from that framework, not using it as it is supposed or as it is meant to be used. There is always that risk. But of course, then it is up to us to hammer down on that risk and ensure that any rules which are in place, which are meant for operators operating within the Maltese economy, are actually used by operators who are actually operating within the Maltese economy.
Fictitious structures
exactly.
are obviously a no-go.
Exactly. And there we are, as I said, pressing down on those sort of abusive structures in order to ensure that there is the adequate substance in Malta, because that is what we are after all. Actual operations. And when it comes to the current rules, I would say apart from all of that, the current rules as we have them today are very complex when it comes to VAT, okay? You have very complex pro rata deduction rules, very complex place of supply rules, which may not necessarily coexist with the rules which are applicable in other member states. For example, some member states interpret sports betting to be electronically supplied services. Our current interpretation is that sports betting is not an electronically supplied service. So you have Malta saying place of supply is Malta. You have another member state saying no, place of supply is my member state. You have a conflict between the rules. You have complications. You have a complexity as to what position you are going to take as a gaming operator. So there is a lot of complexity there, and if you don't have proper advice, if you're, for example, just starting out on a gaming operation venture, and you didn't get the correct advice, potentially you're going to mess it up there if you don't get the correct advice.
And is sort of, once you obtain the advice, is it possible to obtain a VAT ruling as well from the MTCA to give you that comfort as well?
Of course, yes. As you said, we're always open to communicating with any operators. We have an open door policy. We welcome anyone who wishes to contact us and clarify anything within their VAT position and other tax position. When it's other taxes, it wouldn't be me, but when it is VAT, it will probably be me. We have an open door policy, as I said, and operators are more than welcome to reach out to us to get.
Thank you very much, Nico. It was a pleasure, and this brings us to the end of today's podcast. I look forward to possibly invite you again to keep on discussing new salient topics. For the future podcast, we'll actually be inviting other colleagues of yours, Daniel Apsaila, Aldo, Farrugia. So these will also be guests on our podcast, focusing specifically on tax, local and international, and indirect matters. So Nico, thank you very much once again. Pleasure having you.
It was a pleasure to be here again. Thanks a lot, Franklin. Very interesting podcast.